All right, good evening, everyone. I wanted to start with a short apology. I am from the United States, and we're not as smart as you Austrians, so English is pretty much the only language I can speak, so I'm going to have to speak today in English. One other quick question. Does anyone here know how many factory farmers it takes to change a light bulb? None. They want to keep all of us in the dark. So while the book Change of Heart, which I'm here in Europe talking about, covers all social issues or all progressive social issues and some of the science about how those advocating for social issues can be more effective, because animal advocacy is the issue most dear to my heart and that I'm most involved with, and that I know a lot of great work is being done on here in Austria, today I'm going to talk about the science of advocacy. And what the research shows, research from psychology, sociology, communication, what that research can show us about how to be more effective at bringing about the world that we want to see. So to start, I want to go back in time about 2,000 years, over 2,000 years, to the year 300 BC. It was around that time that the practice that we now know as alchemy first got its start. Now, if we think of alchemy today, we probably picture old men, muttering strange things and trying to turn lead into gold. And indeed, that was one of the goals of the alchemists. And today, in 2013, we can look back at what they were doing, and we can think of it as silly and foolish. But in its time, it was taken very seriously. There were schools you could go to learn alchemy. Several European governments licensed official alchemists. There were textbooks, and so on and so forth. And alchemy was around, existed for almost 2,000 years, until the 1700s and 1800s. Now, I don't know if you have noticed, but there's not many alchemists around these days, and that is because in the 1700s and 1800s, it was replaced by chemistry. And whereas alchemy was basically a 2,000-year study or exercise in failure, 2,000 years that produced almost nothing of value to humankind, chemistry in just the past few centuries has produced lots of things that have improved and extended human life. For example, if you enjoy having access to life-saving medication, if you enjoy wasting time on your smartphone, if you enjoy having fresh, clean water coming out of your faucet every morning, and if you enjoy being able to ride around in the car with your friends, you can thank chemistry in part for every one of these things. So now, why did chemistry succeed while alchemy failed? What is the difference between the two? And most importantly of all, why am I standing up here at an animal advocacy talk talking about chemistry and alchemy? The difference between the two is a simple one, but it's also a very fundamental one. And it's one that all of us probably learned back in grade school. And that difference is the scientific method. Alchemists did not use the scientific method. Chemists did use and do use the scientific method. Now, for those of you who can't remember exactly what this scientific method is all about, just as a reminder, it basically boils down to testing. So if you want to assert that something is true or that something works, you have to be able to do testing to show that, yes, this is in fact true, this does in fact work. And if we look up the definition of the word science, in Wikipedia, for example, in the very first sentence, it will tell us that science builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions. So it is testing, it is research that helped chemistry advance step by step out of the murky depths of alchemy. Now, it's easy for us, especially any of you who are university students, to understand the importance of science and research and testing on hard sciences, things like chemistry or biology or physics. But research and testing are being used in all corners of society now. For example, our president in the United States, Barack Obama, was re-elected last year, despite America having one of the worst economies in the past 70 years or so. One of the reasons that the media says that he was re-elected is because his campaign, for the first time ever in a presidential election in our country, really prioritized doing data and testing to figure out which voters were undecided and what messages would be most likely to get those undecided voters to vote for him. He had a team of 50 data analysts who did nothing but do this research and then guide his campaign in the right direction. Businesses use research and testing all the time. They spend tens of billions of euros a year on research and testing to see what products people are more likely to buy, what advertising is going to be more effective, and so on and so forth. It helps them succeed at what they are trying to accomplish. But it's not just in politics and business that testing and research and data is starting to be used. It's also starting to be used in the nonprofit field as well. For example, one of the most pressing or more pressing human health issues today is malaria, a disease which still kills about 5 or 6 million people every year. Now, there are different nonprofits trying to stop the spread of malaria, and one of the things they do is they distribute mosquito nets like these that keep mosquitoes away while people are sleeping at night. And because mosquitoes often carry the malaria virus, nets like these can prevent the spread of malaria and can save lives. But these nonprofits had a question, and that is this: is it better for us to give these nets away for free so that everyone has one? Or is it better to charge a really small price, like €1 or something like that, under the idea that if people pay for it, even if they pay just a tiny bit, that they'll now be more invested in it and more likely to actually make use of the nets? So which one of these two approaches was more effective? Well, it had been a question of opinion or guesses or things like that. But some researchers decided, you know what, let's do a scientific test and just find out. So they tried both approaches in one area, and they found that, lo and behold, it was giving the nets away for free that ended up saving more lives. So simply by doing a little bit of research on the work they were already doing, they were able to show these nonprofits how they could save even more human lives for the same amount of time, the same amount of energy, the same amount of money. Now, the talk tonight, of course, is more focused on animals. And if we think about animals, can this approach, can this use of research and testing also allow all of us who care about animals and who want to create a more animal-friendly world, can we use this research to be more effective in our work? Can we use it to save more animals by expending the same amount of time and money and energy in the work that we are all doing? If we think about the plight of farm animals here in Austria and anywhere around the world, and we think about the things that any of us may do to try to bring about a better world for animals, pretty much everything we do comes down to one single thing, and that is changing human behavior. So whether that's getting an individual to change their diet or the clothing they wear or anything else, whether it's getting politicians to vote a certain way, whether it's getting the heads of companies to change their corporate policies in a way that benefits animals, all of these hinge on changing human behaviors and changing human attitudes many times as well. Now, when we think about changing human behavior and we think about the work that we are doing as animal advocates, there's some things that we as a movement sometimes tell ourselves that sound good, that feel good, but that aren't necessarily true. For example, sometimes we tell ourselves that we as a movement will succeed if we're on the side of compassion and justice. There's a famous quote by Martin Luther King that says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but ultimately it bends towards justice." So we feel that because we're on the side of justice, we are going to succeed. Sometimes we tell ourselves that our movement will succeed because we really, really passionately care about animals. And sometimes we tell ourselves that we'll succeed if we just work very hard. Now, every one of these things is going to help us succeed. They will be helpful to make us more likely to succeed. But if we look around the world right now, and if we look back through history, we can see time and time again that those who are on the right side of compassion and justice, those who cared a lot and those who worked very hard, did not always win. Many, many times they lost, or they are losing right now. So while all of these things are helpful for success, they alone do not guarantee that we, or our movement for animals, will succeed. When it comes to succeeding at changing behaviors and thereby changing society and helping animals, we will succeed if and when we learn what really motivates people to change their attitudes and, most importantly, to change their behavior. And as a result of that, psychology research and related research can really be a roadmap to changing behavior and to changing society. So just as we wouldn't get into our car and drive to a new city or a country we'd never been to before without first taking the time to get directions or at least get our GPS all plugged in and ready to go, it would also be presumptuous of us to think that we know how to lead individuals or politicians or corporate leaders from one attitude to another or from one behavior to another without first taking the time to understand more how the human mind works and how our decisions about what beliefs to have, what behaviors to have, how those processes work. So we as a movement, we as the animal advocacy movement, we really have two choices. Like the alchemists, like the alchemist assumed that they knew how to turn lead into gold, even though there was no testing or no research to show that was true. We can assume that we know the best ways to turn omnivores into vegetarians, to turn politicians who are not animal friendly into politicians who vote in support of animals. We can assume we know the ways to do that, like the alchemists. Or, like the chemists, we can insert the scientific method and research and data and testing into the good work we are already doing to be even more effective for animals. One of the reasons this is so important to do is because our assumptions about what motivates people's attitudes and behaviors are so often incorrect. And I want to give you one example of that from the research. So today, and also in the book Change of Heart, I use research from a wide variety of fields, both the for-profit field, the general sociology field, and also the nonprofit field in a number of areas. So I'm going to look at a number of studies today, or talk about a number of studies today, some of which are specific to animal advocacy, many of which aren't, but the results are very applicable to our work. So, this one study. This was an environmental study carried out in the United States. And the researchers in this study wanted to find out what is the best way to get homeowners to reduce the amount of energy they're using in their homes in order to benefit the environment. So what they did is they created 4 brochures that spoke about reasons to conserve energy. The first one gave the environmental reasons to conserve. The second spoke about the money you could save by reducing your energy use. The third one spoke about the benefits to the community. And the fourth one said that most people in that community were already conserving. Researchers then went around the homes in one neighborhood, and they left just one pamphlet at each home. They then worked with the local utility company to monitor the actual energy usage of these homes over the next 3 months. And of all 4 of these brochures, which one would you guess was most effective at getting people to reduce their home energy usage? Who would say the first one, the one that spoke about the environmental reasons? No? The second one, the one with the financial reasons? All right, about half. Who would say the third one, community benefits? A few people. And who would say the fourth one? Most people are doing it. All right. So, of all 4 of those, it was in fact the fourth one. And in fact, the fourth one was the only one of these 4 brochures that got people to actually reduce their home energy usage. Now, some of you guessed correctly, some of you did not. But the point is this. If I was an environmental activist in this neighborhood, and I wanted people to reduce their home energy usage to protect the environment, I would just assume that, of course, because my concern is the environment, I should talk about the environmental reasons to conserve. Or maybe I would think I'll also appeal to people's financial self-interest and talk about saving money. I would assume I know what messages are going to be most effective. And what studies like this show us is that our assumptions are often incorrect. And that is why when it comes to changing human behavior and changing laws and changing society, it's so important to really get away from philosophy, from guesses, from assumptions, and just look at what works. What does the research say works? What experientially do we see actually works and works best? Now, thankfully for us, if you were to go to your university library here, you would find thousands and thousands of studies documenting what does work and what doesn't work, and changing attitudes and changing behaviors. And perhaps for some of you, the idea of sitting down to read thousands of studies sounds like a fun time. But I imagine for most of us, the idea of doing all that reading sounds a little bit scary, right? And not very fun at all. So no need to worry. I've tried to do as much of that very boring reading as possible for you and put it into 2 books. So the first one is Change of Heart, and that looks at the general research on attitude and behavior change and how that works and what the research says. and a second book that just came out called Veganomics, which looks at all of this sort of research specific to vegetarianism and veganism. And so what I'm going to do with the rest of my time tonight is share with you what I consider to be some of the most important points from this research. Most important in that it is most useful to us as animal advocates to make us more effective in the work that we're doing. All right, so let's get right into it. So first, and most of what I'm going to talk about is some tools we can use to be more effective at persuading others. Again, whether that's persuading people to change their diet or what they wear, to vote a certain way, to get active, to change their policies if they're a corporate or institutional leader. How can we be more effective at persuading people to change their behavior in a way that helps animals? All right, first question, stories versus statistics. So if we look at these two things, if we're talking to a member of the public or even our friend or family member about factory farming and vegetarianism, is it better to tell stories about individual animals? Is it better to talk about the number of animals suffering and how widespread the suffering is? Or is it better to do both? Which is going to be more effective? Well, some researchers wanted to put this to the test scientifically. Now, they were not animal activists, so the issue that they looked at was another serious issue, starvation in Africa. And they created 3 fundraising letters. The first one talked about how big the problem was. So it talked about the millions of people starving to death each year, the tens of millions of people displaced by war and famine, and so on and so forth. The second letter didn't have any of that. It just had a story of one young African girl and what life was like for her on a day-to-day basis as a child facing starvation. And the third letter had both. It had the statistics and how big the problem was, but it also had the story of that young girl. So the fundraising letters were sent out, donations came back, and which one of these messages do you think got people to donate the most and thereby save the most people from starvation? Who would say the first one, the one that had the statistics? Right. Who would say the second one, the one with the story? And who would say the third one, the one with the story and the statistics? So we have about a split here. Half people think the second one, half people think the third. So it turns out that one letter did about twice as good as the other two. And that was in fact the second letter. And as you can see, the letter that had both the story and the statistics did only slightly better than the one that had the statistics only. Now, if we human beings were logical creatures, hearing that 5 million people were starving to death should make us donate more money than hearing that one person is facing starvation. But again, we're not logical creatures, and for whatever reason, both in this study and some other studies, researchers have found that when we humans tend to think in terms of numbers, and think with that analytical part of our brain, most of us, not all of us, but most of us become less compassionate, less willing to change, less willing to donate, less willing to do what is going to make the situation better. At the same time, stories are very powerful. And let me give you one other example of that from the research. There was another study that was carried out by a university professor who had the students in his class design and give a talk about a subject of their choice. After all the talks were given that day, he polled the students to see what they remembered of one another's talks. And what he found was that of the facts and statistics presented that day, only about 5% were remembered at the end of that class by other students. But of the stories that had been presented that day, a full 60% were remembered by other students in the class. So not only do stories make us more empathetic and more caring, but they are also inherently more sticky. They stick in our mind, we remember them. They have emotional power, they have power over our beliefs and over our behavior. So what does that mean when it comes to advocating for animals? What it means is that the more we focus on these individual stories, the more we focus on telling people what life is like on a day-to-day basis for one individual animal on a factory farm, the more effective we'll be at persuading people to make a change. Moving on, the best request. We all want the most we can get out of life, right? We want the most fun, we want the most success, and we as animal activists want to achieve the most change possible for animals. But what is the best request that we should make of the public when we're encouraging them to change their behavior? So for example, I used to do a lot of talks in high schools where I would talk to students about factory farming and the environmental impacts, the impacts on animals. So let's say that tomorrow, I was going to go into a high school or a university class here in Vienna. And I was going to talk about these animal issues, right? What request do you think I should make of the audience? Ideally, in my ideal world, what I really think every one of those students should do is go vegan, is only eat organic food, is become a full-time animal rights activist for the rest of their life, is donate all their money to animal protection work, is not drive a car, is not have children, and on and on and on, right? Lots of different things that ideally I would like all of these students to do, and I think would be an ethically good thing to do. But if I encourage them to do all of these things, they're going to probably think I'm crazy, and they're not going to do anything at all, right? So if I'm going into this classroom, is it better for me to make a large request and basically ask for everything I want? Is it better to make a small request, something very, very easy that almost everyone could do? Or is it better to ask something in the middle? Which one of these is going to create the most behavior change, and in so doing, spare the greatest number of animals? Well, some researchers wanted to examine this very question. Again, they were not animal activists, so the studies done in this area are more general studies about messaging and behavior change. But they found that there was one type of message that tended to create the most behavior change. Who here would guess that it was the small request? All right. Who would guess that it is the medium request? And who would guess that it is the large request? All right. So of course, everything, small, medium, and large are all relative, but by and large, they found that it was in fact a medium request. The best request, the request that created the most behavior change, was the one that was a significant change, but that people could probably picture themselves doing it. If people definitely could not picture themselves making that change, very few people were likely to make the change. And if it was a very small request, yes, maybe it was easy to do and maybe a number of people did it. But because it was such a small change, overall, it did create a huge amount of behavior change. So when we as animal activists, if we're talking about, for example, promoting vegetarian eating or vegan eating, to use that as an example, when we're promoting that among the public, what does this mean that our best request would be? Well, here we kind of get into the area of guesses and assumptions, which of course is not a good area to be in, but looking at that research, my personal assumption, and looking at the other studies I've seen, my personal assumption is this. Right now, in 2013, most people cannot picture themselves as vegans, if you're talking about the general public. I would think some people, but still not the majority, could picture themselves being vegetarian, but virtually everyone could picture themselves eating less meat. So my assumption, based on this research, is that probably the best request for us as animal advocates, the request that's likely to create the most behavior change and spare the greatest number of animals, is somewhere in the range of reducing meat consumption to possibly, for some audiences, such as university students, going vegetarian. I think those are things that people are more likely to be able to picture themselves doing, and therefore it will create more behavior change and save more animals. One other thing to keep in mind when we consider about what requests we're making of the audience, and this and the next slide are specific to vegetarian and vegan advocacy, is that when it comes to the animals that we human beings eat, the number of animals affected by our diet choices and the amount of suffering we cause by our diet choices varies animal to animal. Now, this chart is from data from the United States, so the situation, I'm sure, is not exactly the same here in Austria. But probably there's a very similar trend, and that is this. While people eat lots of different types of meat, lots of beef and pork and chicken and fish and lamb and other things, if you look at the number of days of suffering it causes, so if you add up all the individual animals the average meat eater eats, and you look at how long they live and how many days of suffering they endure on these farms, and you add it all together, and then you look at how it breaks down by species, what we see is that nearly all of the suffering that is caused by people eating meat and other animal products is caused to chickens, whether they're laying eggs or chickens raised for meat, and fish raised on fish farms. It's nearly over 95% of the suffering. So, what does this mean for us? It means that if we're chatting with a friend, with a family member, with a member of the public who is not willing to go vegan or go vegetarian, then perhaps what we could encourage them to do, to start, is simply cut out chicken, or cut out chicken and farm-raised fish as a starting point. Not only is that an easier request that probably more people could picture themselves doing, but simply doing that, simply cutting out chicken, for example, would spare close to half of the suffering that they are currently causing. See that chicken? All right, moving on. Next technique I want to talk about is foot in the door. And you may be able to guess what this is all about, but let me give you one example from the research of what foot in the door is all about and how we can use it to be more effective advocates for animals. So there were some researchers who wanted to promote safe driving in their community. So they went around to homes in a particular neighborhood, knocked on doors, and they brought with them these kind of ugly yard signs that said, "Drive safely." So they knocked on doors, they said, "Hi, we're promoting safe driving in the community, and we wondered if you would put this yard sign out in your front yard." But because the signs were not exactly attractive, only about 20% of homeowners agreed to and did put the yard signs out in their front yard. The researchers then went to other homes in the same neighborhood, but this time they left the yard signs at home. And they brought with them these little 5 centimeter by 5 centimeter window stickers that also said, "Drive safely." Knocked on doors, said, "Hi, we're promoting safe driving. We're hoping you would put up this window sticker." And because it was such an easy thing to do, virtually everyone said yes and did put up these little window stickers. Well, 3 weeks later, researchers went back to the same homes that had gotten the little window stickers. Knocked on doors, said, "Hi, it's me again. Thank you so much for putting up that window sticker. And now we wondered if you would put this yard sign out in your front yard." And this time, not 20%, but about 70% of people agreed to and did put the yard sign out in their front yard. So in other words, even though the main goal of researchers was to get these yard signs out in the front yard, they were much more effective at doing so by first making a similar, smaller request that people were likely to say yes to, waiting for a little time to pass, and then going back and making their second, real, larger request. This is what foot in the door is all about, and there are literally over 1,000 academic studies documenting the power of foot in the door. To give you just 2 other very quick examples, in another study, people asked to sign a petition to support the building of a recreation center for the physically handicapped. The next week, donated twice as much money to support that as people who were never even asked to sign the petition. Similarly, people asked to wear a pin promoting the Canadian Cancer Society. The next week, donated again about twice as much money to that organization as people who were not even asked to wear the pin. Now, why does this happen? Why does foot in the door work so well? Well, the reason that researchers think it works is because when we do something, even if it's a small thing, even if it's wearing a pin, signing a petition, wearing a bracelet, when we do some small thing, or anything, even if it's small, we start to shift our sense of self-identity. So once I get that little window sticker that says "Drive safely" and I stick it up in my window, even if the only reason I'm doing it is just to be polite or just because it seems easy to do, once I've done that, I start to think of myself subconsciously as, I guess I am the sort of person who cares about promoting safe driving, otherwise why the heck would I put that sticker up in my window? And because we start to shift our sense of self-identity, then when someone comes back and asks us to put the sign in our yard, or take the next large step, whatever it is, because it seems like the sort of person we are, like I'm the sort of person that would do that, lo and behold, yes, we are more likely to do that thing. Now, what does this mean for us as animal advocates? Well, one concern that some animal advocates have is that they have the belief that we should always and only promote veganism, that we should not promote welfare reforms to help animals, that we should not encourage people to eat less meat, that we should not encourage corporate policy changes that do something good even if they don't accomplish everything we would like. And their reasoning, the logic that they try to put forward is this. If we ask for anything less than exactly what we want, which is a purely vegan world, say, then yes, we may get a law that reduces animal suffering. Yes, some people may start eating less meat. But the problem is that they'll become complacent. That as individuals, they'll stop there, that as a society, we will stop there. And they won't go on to ultimately become the society or the individual with the individual dietary choices that we would like to have. Thankfully, what foot in the door research shows us is that we don't have to have this concern. People, as well as societies that make small changes, become more likely to make larger changes in the same direction as time goes on. It's been documented in study after study, both on the individual level and on the society level. So, for example, organizations that promote, I don't know if Meatless Monday is a popular idea, is a thing here in Austria, but in the UK and in the US, there's groups encouraging people to just not eat meat on Mondays. So things like this Meatless Monday campaign or meat reduction campaigns, not only do they help many animals in the short term by getting people to change their diet and reduce the number of animals being raised, but also, because of foot in the door, and because if we think back to that best request, it makes people more likely to eventually go vegetarian, eventually go vegan. And in fact, if we look to surveys of people who have different diets, we see in these surveys that those who have started cutting back on meat are much more interested and have much more of a desire to go vegetarian or go vegan than those who haven't. And the same works on the societal level as well. All right, moving on, let's talk about social norms. So, we all like to think of ourselves as individuals, right? We have the behaviors we have, and we have the attitudes we have, because we've thought about them at length, and we've decided, this is who I am, this is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to do. But the reality is that we don't want to admit is that really, we're just like everybody else, right? We're very influenced by what other people think and do, either other people in general, or at least other people in our social and peer group. As a result of this, messages that say lots of other people are doing something are very effective at getting more people to do that thing. We saw that earlier in the study on home energy usage. And there are countless other studies documenting the same thing, that often a social norms message is more effective than a cause-based message. Let me give you just one other example of that from the research. There was a hotel chain that wanted their guests to start reusing the bath towels each night. Now, their reason for this was financial, because if people did not reuse the bath towels and wanted new towels every day, it was a lot more laundry to do. So that meant more staff, running the washing machines, running the dryers. It just meant more money spent. But of course, it would also be good for the environment if people reused the bath towels. So the hotel went around, and you can't see it very well in this picture, but they put little signs up in each hotel room that basically said, in order to help us protect the planet, we encourage you to please reuse your bath towels. And you know what? The signs did work. Some people did start reusing the bath towels. But some researchers who happened to be staying at the hotel thought they could do a little bit of a better job. So, working with the hotel, they took out all those old signs, and they put in new signs that had one sentence. And that was, most guests in this hotel reuse their bath towels. It said nothing about the environment whatsoever. And switching from the environmental to the social norms message, you guessed it, increased towel use by about 25% in this case. And when the signs were made even more specific, so they said most guests in room 309, or whatever room it was, in this room reuse the bath towels. Again, towel use increased even further. It's sad that we human beings work this way, right? But this is the way that we operate. And so the more we understand how psychologically we as human animals work, the more effective we can be at changing society. Now, what does social norms mean for us as animal advocates, or in this example, as advocates of vegetarian and vegan eating? What it means is this. Of course, we want to talk about the cruelty done to animals on farms. Of course, we want to talk about, for example, the health benefits of vegetarian and vegan eating. But if we also add in a social norms message, we'll be more effective at getting other people to agree. This is true when it comes to vegetarian eating, so we can point to the growing percentage of vegetarians in Austria and vegans in Austria, the growing availability of vegan food at restaurants and grocery stores here in Vienna. The same is true for other issues. So any political issues or laws that are being worked on, trying to get passed to help animal welfare, the more we can show that the majority of the public agrees with us, the more likely we will be to get the rest of society to start agreeing with us as well. And because social norms are very powerful, there's one other implication of that. And that is, the more similar we are to our audience, the more likely we are to be able to persuade them to make the changes we would like them to make. So research has shown, and many studies have shown, that the more similar we are to our audience, similar in things like age, gender, the way we dress, our political beliefs, our social beliefs, whether or not we smoke, even the way we speak, studies have shown that in each one of these areas, the more similar we are to our audience, the more likely they are to change their beliefs and to change their behaviors in the way we're encouraging them to do. So what does this mean for us as animal advocates? Well, it means that we need to tailor how we present ourselves and our message to our audience. So if we were doing work to support some new law we're trying to get passed, if we're doing work to support that at a punk rock concert, we probably want to look one way. And if we're doing it at a conference of conservative politicians, we probably want to dress and speak in a different manner if we want to be as effective as possible. One of our goals as animal advocates is that for any conversation we have with the public, so let's say it's to support a bill to better protect pigs in Austria. One of our goals from every conversation we have with people about this issue is that when they walk away from us, they walk away thinking, that person is just like me, and they think this law should be passed. And they think pigs should be protected, and they think we should be vegetarian. The more they walk away thinking that we are just like them, and we have this belief, the more likely we will be to persuade them to care about animals and to support this cause or this behavior that would save the lives of animals. One other thing this means is that if we want to be as effective as possible in working for animals, then when we're having a conversation with the public about these issues, we probably want to leave other social and political issues off the table, unless we know we agree with the other person. Because if I'm talking to a member of the public, and when we're talking about animal issues, but it gets into politics or social issues, chances are we're not going to agree on everything. And the more apparent it becomes that we don't agree on other issues, the more likely it is that this person will write me off. So if I'm a liberal and they're a conservative, and that comes up in conversation, then it's easier for them to say, well, of course, he thinks that pigs should be protected. He's a liberal. Liberals are stupid. They don't know anything. So of course, he's going to think that. This is why it's important for us to leave those other social, political, any other issues off the table if we want to be as effective as possible in getting people to change their behaviors in ways that save the lives of animals, unless we know we agree with them. So if we know they're a fan of the same football club as us, or if they have the same social beliefs on marriage equality as us, great to bring those up because it's a commonality. But we shouldn't bring them up unless we're sure that we feel the same way. Now, when it comes to targeting our audience, there's one other question, and that is this. There are certain groups in society who are more likely to care about these issues, more likely to vote the way we want them to vote, more likely to change their diet and go vegetarian and go vegan. The more that we focus our animal advocacy efforts on these audiences, the more good will get done. So for example, if we're promoting vegetarian eating, focusing our efforts on those most likely to change will spare many more animals than focusing on society as a whole. So who are those two groups most likely to care, most likely to change their diet, and most likely to support animal protection in general? Well, the first is women. In every country it's ever been measured in, the number of female vegetarians outnumbers the number of male vegetarians by at least a 2-to-1 ratio, often a 3-to-1 ratio. Secondly, young people. Those between the ages of about 14 and 30 are much more likely to go vegetarian, to go vegan, and to be supportive of animal protection issues than the rest of the public. So the more that we focus our animal advocacy efforts, and especially our vegetarian advocacy efforts, on young people and on women, the more good we'll do in the same amount of time. The more lives we'll save for the same amount of time and money and energy. Lastly, showing them how. Because we know how badly animals suffer, I know thankfully, thanks to the work of some people in this room, I know that this no longer exists here in Austria, but unfortunately it does in the United States, the battery cages for egg-laying hens. Because we know how badly farm animals suffer, or animals in general, we often want to focus on telling people why they should change their diet, the many reasons they should do it, why they should support this law, so on and so forth. We tell people why, but we don't spend nearly enough time telling people how to make the behavior changes, such as diet change, that we would like them to make. And one of the reasons for this is that, when we've done something for a long time, it becomes easy to us, we become used to it. And so it seems like this is a very easy thing to do. And we forget that for someone who has never done this before, it can seem like an almost impossible task, right? So in addition to telling people why to change their diet, we need to be sure to focus on telling them how to do it. And there's one study that really drove home the importance of this. It was a meta-analysis that came out a couple years ago that looked at 210 behavior change studies from around the world. And what it found is that, so not surprisingly, it found that attitude was important. So people who wanted to make a change and thought it was a good change to make were more likely to make that change. Nothing surprising there. But the surprising thing was this. Attitude was not the biggest predictor of whether or not people changed their behavior. The biggest predictor was whether or not they felt they had the ability to make that change. So the why is important, but the how is just as important and maybe even slightly more important. Now, when we're talking about vegetarian or vegan eating specifically, what are those main barriers that the public sees? What are the how reasons that we need to address with them, that we need to share with them, to make them not only want to go vegetarian and go vegan, but feel like I have the ability to go vegetarian or go vegan. So if we look to the studies, both in Europe and in other parts of the world, we see there are four main barriers, four main reasons that people either don't go vegetarian or that vegetarians or vegans go back to eating meat. So here they are, in descending order of importance. So the most important barrier is taste. Now, I don't know how anyone could look at a block of cold, wet tofu and think that is not the most delicious thing I've ever seen in my life. But apparently some people have that perception. So people worry that vegan food does not taste good, and they worry about giving up the flavors that they know and love. So that's the biggest barrier. Second, and close behind, is health. Some people have the perception that it's not healthy to be vegetarian or vegan. And the biggest health concern of all, especially among young people, which probably many of you have heard, is protein. Being worried about getting enough protein. Third, convenience issues. People feel like they don't know where to find vegan food in the restaurants or grocery stores or how to prepare it. Fourth and finally, social issues. People worry that it would be too hard socially to be a vegetarian because if I'm hanging out with my friends and my family and we go out to eat, there's nothing I'll be able to eat, and so it won't really work. So these are the four main barriers we have. And so if we want people to go vegetarian or stay vegetarian, we need to show people how to find delicious, really delicious vegan food, how to find it in the restaurants and in the grocery stores, perhaps how to prepare a few simple things. We need to give them a couple simple tips on how to stay healthy and be as healthy as possible as vegetarians and vegans. And we need to give them some advice on dealing with these social situations where they're having holiday meals or meals out with family and friends who are not themselves vegetarians. Again, this is important to do not only for inspiring more people to go vegetarian or vegan, but also for getting people to stay with that diet. Because the very unfortunate reality is that for every 4 people right now who say they're a vegetarian, 3 of them will eventually go back to eating meat. The more we can address these how reasons, the more we can make people feel they know how to carry on this diet and have an easy time doing it, the more effective it will be at inspiring more people to change and at keeping people in that diet. All right, so we talked for a while about some tools, a few tools we can use to inspire other people in society to change. But before I finish, I want to take a few minutes to talk about ourselves, our own psychology, and how our own psychology can either help or hurt our efforts at creating that world we want to see for animals. You know, it can sometimes be difficult to face ourselves and to face our real motivations for doing the work, the animal advocacy work that any of us do. Certainly, I imagine every one of us here today who considers themselves an animal advocate, I'm sure that for all of us, one of the main reasons is because we care about animals. And we want to create a better world for them. We want to spare their lives, save their lives, and their misery, so on and so forth. But we probably have other, more personal motivations as well. For example, we probably have the motivation of wanting to be ourselves and express our beliefs. You know, I think most of us want to let the world know what we think and what we feel about issues that are important to us. We may also have the motivation of wanting to have fun. So we'll pick the events to go to, and the campaigns to work on, and the actions to take, based on if our friends are doing them, if they seem somewhat enjoyable, and so forth. And lastly, probably all of us have the motivation of wanting to feel good, of wanting to feel like we are on the side of compassion and justice, of wanting to feel like our lives have more meaning because we are working to make the world a better place. Now, every one of these personal motivations is natural. These are natural motivations. Each one of these is an important part of being a happy and healthy human being. There's nothing wrong with them. But we do have to realize that sometimes these personal motivations, it can conflict with that other motivation that we probably all have of wanting to do as much good as we can for animals. So let me give you a couple examples of that. All right, so I was talking earlier about giving talks in, say, a high school here in Vienna or college here in Vienna about these issues. So if one of these two men that I'm about to show you were tomorrow to go and give this talk about factory farming and vegetarian eating, which one do you think would be more effective at persuading students or the general public to care about these issues and to change their diet? Which one of these two men do you think would be more effective? And yes, in case you weren't sure, this is me on the left. Right? That's me about 10 years ago. It would be great if we lived in a world where we did not judge one another, or society did not judge one another based on appearance. But as we all know from our own experience, and as the research makes clear, society really does. People really do judge one another based on appearance. And study after study show that the more mainstream we look and the more mainstream attractive we can make ourselves be, the more likely we will be to persuade people to change their attitudes and change their behaviors in a way that saves the lives of animals. And while it took me a while to get over that hump and actually change my appearance just to look as mainstream as possible, but here's the thing that I thought about that eventually got me to go ahead with it. I thought, if my mom was going to be killed, if my mom was going to be killed, and I knew I had a chance at saving her, and I knew that chance would be 20% or 30% or 40% more if I just looked a certain way, wore certain clothes or cut my hair a certain way. Of course I would do that. Of course, any one of us would do that, right? Unless we hit our mom, but any of us would do that. So if I would do that for one person, then of course I should do the same to be able to save thousands and thousands of additional animals. So like it or not, appearance does influence how persuasive we'll be, and simply changing our appearance can enable us, over the course of our lives, to spare thousands and thousands of additional animals from a lifetime of suffering. Interactions are another area. So let's say I'm volunteering with an animal protection group here, and I'm doing outreach on the street about some new law that we're trying to get passed to protect farm animals. And someone on the street stops and they want to talk to me about it, and they're not necessarily on board, but they're interested in having a discussion about it. What is going on in the back of my mind? So in the back of my mind, let's say it's this is not a good example because I know this is more or less banned here in Austria already, but let's say a ban on gestation crates, the small crates that pregnant pigs are kept in in the United States for their entire life, not even able to turn around, right? So let's say that in the US I was campaigning for a ban on these gestation crates to get rid of them entirely. Someone's talking to me, what in the back of my mind am I thinking? Am I thinking, I need to tell this person that the animals are confined so small they can't turn around, and it's the worst thing ever, and I've been on these farms and it's just horrible, and that the only people that support these laws are these conservative politicians who are in bed with the farmers, and they're so bad, and that passing this law is going to be good for animals, and that the majority of the public supports it, and on and on and on and on and on. Or, in the back of my mind, am I thinking, who is this person standing in front of me, and what can I say, and how can I say it, that's going to be most likely to get them to agree with me and to support this law, this effort that would save animals. Those are two fundamentally different approaches. The first is focused on expressing what I believe, what I know, and what I want. And the second starts with the end goal in mind. What do you want? And then it works back from there. How do I get it? What can I say that's going to be most likely to get this person to change their behavior in a way that saves the lives, or that spares the misery of these animals? Lastly, in terms of our choice of activity, if we think about, obviously there's many ways that animals are used and abused, and there's, as a result, so many different things that we as animal advocates can do to speak up for animals. So how do we choose how we spend the limited amount of time and energy that we have as animal activists? Do we work on campaigns that are fun or funny or seem entertaining? Do we work on the issues that our friends are involved with? Do we work on the issues that happen to be in the media right now? Do we work on issues that we feel we have a personal stake in? For example, if I have a dog at home I love, maybe I focus on dog issues. Or do we kind of take a step back and really think to ourselves, of all the issues out there, and of all the different campaigns I could work on, what is likely to do the most good, save the greatest number of animals, reduce the greatest amount of animal suffering? Again, two fundamentally different approaches. Pretty much all of us start with and operate for a long time on that first method, that first set of motivations. I know I did. We all start with that desire to do good, to stand up for animals, to stand up for against their mistreatment. But we need to go beyond that. We need to go not just from doing good, we need to go beyond that to doing the most good for animals. If we think about the for-profit companies of the world, Coca-Cola, Adidas, so on and so forth, they all have a bottom line. Now their bottom line, of course, is dollars and cents. And so every decision they make, who to advertise to, what to sell, where to set up their stores, on and on and on. Every one of these decisions is made with an eye towards what is going to make us the most money. If it's going to make them more money, they do it. If it's going to make them less money, they don't do it. We as animal advocates, we have a bottom line as well. Now our bottom line, of course, is not dollars and cents, but I would submit to you that our bottom line is two things. It's saving the lives and sparing the misery of as many animals as possible. And the more that we adopt this bottom line mentality as activists, the more we do that, we can become exponentially more effective. So if we think about whatever animal you have come to care about the most in your life, if there is such an animal. Maybe it was a cat or dog or rabbit you had at home. Maybe it's a farm animal you met at a sanctuary somewhere else. But think about whatever animal you may hold nearest and dearest in your heart. If we think about that animal, that individual, and we think about any individual animal, if we truly believe that every individual animal, their life matters, their pain matters, their pleasure matters, they should be prevented from having cruelty inflicted upon them. If we truly believe that, then ethically, I feel we have an obligation, an ethical obligation to help as many individuals as possible. And so if doing one thing can help 100 individuals over the course of a year, and putting our time in another direction can help 1,000 individuals over the course of a year, then I feel we have the ethical obligation to do what's going to, again, save the most lives and spare the most individuals from a lifetime of misery. And one thing this means is that oftentimes, especially when it comes to changing individuals' behaviors in society, that oftentimes, and even on a political level oftentimes, focusing on farm animal issues is the area where we can help the greatest number of those individuals. So these numbers are also from the US, but I think they speak a kind of universal truth. So over the past several years, here are the number of animals who are not being killed and suffering life of misery as a result of animal activists working in these fields. Animal activists working against animal testing, against fur, working on behalf of companion animals and wild animals, working against the use of animals in entertainment. As a result of all the animal advocacy work done in these areas in the US, to the best of my sense, and these are definitely not exact figures, but roughly, it's a little less than 1 million animals a year that are being spared misery in these fields thanks to the work of animal advocates. Now, 1 million lives not suffering is phenomenal. That's fantastic. That's great. It's commendable. It's applaudable. It's wonderful. But over the past few years, here are the number of animals not being killed, not living life in misery, as a result of people advocating for diet change. Of course, advocating on behalf of farm animals. 500 million. Even though dramatically more money is spent on these issues combined than is spent in the US on promoting diet change. Now, it's not that the activists working on diet change are smarter or harder working or anything like that. It's just a function of the fact that because there's so many farm animals raised and killed, and because virtually every member of society who isn't vegan or vegetarian is contributing to the suffering every day with their decisions, the simple fact is that it is with farm animals it is with diet change issues, and it is with laws that further protect farm animals from cruelty, that oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes, we'll be able to do the most good and spare the greatest number of individuals for the same amount of time, the same amount of money, the same amount of energy. It is bizarre that this is the case, but the reality is that every one of us in this room, over the course of our lifetime, we can spare tens of thousands of individuals like her from a brutal death and a lifetime of day-to-day suffering. It's bizarre that any one of us should have the power to affect the lives of tens of thousands of animals. But the reality is that we do, we really do. Just by promoting diet change alone on a consistent basis, we have that ability. And of course, by also being involved in political efforts to pass laws that protect many animals, we can have that same effect. Or working for corporate policy changes that would spare many animals, we can have that effect. Each one of us has a tremendous, tremendous amount of power. And I would ask you, the thing that inspired me to put other social issues that I care deeply about to the side and focus my life on animal issues was seeing a talk about 11 years ago where two speakers said basically the same thing. If we think about the misery, now we haven't showed really slides of animals being abused, but I'm sure everyone here has seen them. So if we picture that, if we picture the way we know those animals are abused, is there any use of our time, of our energy, of our money, of our nights, of our weekends, of spare change in our pocket? Is there any better use of any of those things than working to successfully and effectively end as much of that misery as we can in our lives? Certainly, I would submit to you, there is not. So we have tremendous power, we just have to put it to use, and the more we look to research and data to guide us in our work, and the more we adopt that bottom line mentality, the more effective we'll be, the more change we'll be able to create in society, and the exponentially more lives we will save or spare from misery. That's it that I have for tonight. For anyone that is interested in hearing more about psychology and social change or some of the research, again, the books are Change of Heart and Veganomics. And for anyone that didn't get one of these little flyers, it has the websites for the books on it. There's, I think they're around somewhere. You can read a couple chapters for free and just see more what it's all about. So thank you so much for the work that you were doing. Thank you for coming out here tonight. And if anybody has questions, I think we have some time. So thank you.
Ganz kurz auf Deutsch, ganz egoistisch. Es gibt auch einen Journal Club, also wir machen auch immer Texte zu dem Thema. Wer Interesse hat, weil es sind immer wieder neue Gesichter, kann sich hier eintragen. Also wir versuchen die Originaltexte, die in wissenschaftlichen Journals eben publiziert sind, dann von Zeit zu Zeit alle 1-2 Monate zu behandeln. Ich gebe das einfach durch. Und bevor ich es ganz vergesse, Sie können auch die Webseite, wo die Forschungsprojekte sind, unter criticalanimalstudies.at finden Sie dann auch neue Publikationen. Ja, aber jetzt gehe ich dann über Fragen. Okay. Bernd, please.
Hi, I recognize some of your examples from the books from the Heath brothers, so I heard quite a lot about them. And I think one of the most important things in those books for me was the aspect of changing the environment. We didn't talk anything about it, but I think it's very much important to our work as well. So basically, you can argue that you have said it implicitly because you talked about so persuading people, and you need to persuade people to change the environment as well. But I think we should talk about that as well. Have you some viewpoints about that collected as well?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And there is one chapter in the book that does talk about that to some extent, but I don't include it here just because, I guess both because there's so many things to it that could be included and also because it's probably harder for individuals to bring about those changes. But that is a very good point. So as he was mentioning, the things I was talking about today was mainly about getting individuals to change the behavior. But when we can change social structures so it becomes easier to make compassionate decisions, it becomes much easier to do so, and people are much more likely to do it. So there's a lot to be said for organizations or for groups that have this power to work on those institutional changes that make the hows of be it eating vegan or whatever else easier to do. So an example of that would be if there was a student club here at the university who got the dining services to have many more vegan options and have those featured right as people walked into the cafeteria, so they were the first thing people saw, it would make people more inclined to think about eating these things, to perhaps pick it up, even if it's just kind of on impulse, and in so doing, make it easier for people to live in a way that is more compassionate for animals, without them having to decide for themselves. And the same holds true for passing laws that reduce the suffering of farm animals. If we think of the laws that groups have been able to pass, here in Austria, that reduce suffering of farm animals, we bypass having to get every single individual to change their diet, and we get everyone's diet to become instantly more compassionate, a little bit, just by passing these laws. So yes, that is an incredibly important approach as well. And for those groups and organizations that have the power and the muscle to be able to accomplish these changes, I absolutely believe that at times these can be much more effective than working for change on the individual level. One other good example that's been going well in the US recently is promoting school-wide Meatless Monday programs at grade schools. So for example, in several school districts in the US, such as Los Angeles, one of our biggest cities, now, because of these policy changes, on Monday, in every elementary school in the entire city of Los Angeles, every meal is a vegetarian meal. So that's 680,000 vegetarian meals being served every Monday just because of passing this policy change. So it's a very good point. I'm glad you raised it. That is definitely a way that we, our organizations, can accomplish a lot of good without having to go person by person by person. Questions?
If everybody goes vegan, will there still be domestic animals, or will they die out?
Thanks. Yeah. So they are bred specifically to be raised for meat and killed. So as the consumption of meat goes down, the number of animals being bred and existing goes down as well. So if that gradual process continued, and in this ideal world we got to everyone being vegan, the number of farm animals would just go down and down and down because they were not being bred. So we wouldn't have, there wouldn't be cows running around the streets of Vienna or anything like that. Yeah. Did that make sense, right? They wouldn't be bred, so they wouldn't.
They won't be on farms either. They will be nowhere.
That's correct. Yes, unless people have them as sanctuaries, or maybe their wild ancestors, like wild boars off in the forest or something like that.
Yeah, I was wondering, does the research from the foot in the door stuff, does that suggest that the debate about reform and abolition is over?
Please again, can you stand up and a little bit
louder?
Yeah,
whether the results from the foot in the door research, whether that suggests that the reform abolition debate is over.
My personal opinion and my reading of the research, not just based on foot in the door, but also based on other things, is that yes, that there does not need to be a debate any longer, because if we're debating on philosophy and theory, anyone can have any philosophical position and say this is the pure correct thing to do regardless of the results. So some people may still have those philosophical reasons, but when it comes to practically what is good for animals, what helps the most animals, what helps the most animals in the long term as well, and brings us closer to that vegan world, I think if we look at foot in the door, if we look at the consumption rates of different animal products in countries that have passed welfare laws concerning those sort of products, if we look at the studies done on the impact of animal welfare legislative campaigns, when those are in the media, the impacts that has on consumption, if we look at all these things in total, every point in the research points in one direction, and that is not only do incremental laws that reduce the suffering of animals, not only do they help many animals in the short term, and reduce a lot of suffering in the short term, but they also inspire more people to cut meat out of their diet, and they bring us more closer to additional reforms and additional changes, and just society in general thinking of animals as beings that deserve ethical consideration, and thus society moving more towards that vegan world that we ideally would like to see. So yes, I certainly think if we're concerned with results, And if we're concerned not with our own purity, but with actually helping as many animals as possible, then yes, all the research points in that direction.
One question.
So when you said right now, which are those countries who imply which kind
Können Sie vielleicht aufstehen, dann hört man Sie besser. Entschuldigung.
Well, I'm referring to what you just said. Which are those countries that made those special rules and special political blah blah blah
That
made a real effect?
Sure, yeah.
Because that's
So
really American style. Like, yes, there is some change in the world, but where?
Okay,
how?
absolutely.
Like,
Also, if you want to see me afterwards, I can give you a website link where I gave a talk on this very subject at the US Animal Rights Conference last year. And I have a video of the PowerPoint with the links to all the research papers that I'm citing. So I'd be happy to give you that link afterwards. But for that specifically, so in preparing that talk, I actually looked to the European Union and countries here. And what I did is I looked at all the data from the EU, the European Union's statistics database, which they have all the consumption trends online. So I went through all that data and I looked at countries in the EU or other European countries like Switzerland that aren't in the EU. And I looked at those countries that had, as independent countries, passed bans on battery cages. And they looked at those countries in the EU that had not independently passed bans, but who were of course covered by the EU-wide ban on unenriched battery cages. And I looked at the egg consumption trends in those countries in the years that followed each of their switches. And if you compare the two, the countries that independently banned it, so therefore there was legislation going on there were stories in the media, so on and so forth, versus the countries that didn't, you saw, relative to the EU average, the countries that did not have independent bans, egg consumption in those countries dropped. If you add all the countries together and average it out, it varied country to country. But if you average it out, it dropped by about 5 to 7% compared to the EU average. So that's one example. If you also look to the literature produced by agricultural economists that look at how consumption is influenced by price fluctuations, they are absolutely clear. There's a great book called Compassion by the Pound, which is by two, Compassion by the Pound. Pound, like not kilos, but pounds in the US. They're two US agricultural economists. These are people who work in the farm animal industry. Compassion by the Pound. They talk in there, and they and other agricultural economists have talked elsewhere about how it is basically accepted agriculture economist fact that when price goes up, consumption goes down. There's not a, it varies product to product. Some products it's more, some products it's less. But anytime price goes up, consumption goes down. And so any of these welfare reforms that drive price up, which essentially every welfare reform does, is by fact going to drive consumption down at least slightly. So those would be two examples. But again, I'd be happy to give you the exact URL afterwards. It's on the blog for the nonprofit I work for, Farm Sanctuary, which is ccc.farmsanctuary.org. ccc.farmsanctuary.org. And then you go to the blog, you have to kind of scroll down to find it. But I can also give you the exact link later.
But did I hear the two words vegan and vision? Or did I mishear something? You said something about a vegan vision, because I don't think that every human being in the world wants to be vegan, vegetarian. Some might, but there are people who like eating meat, and who like to continue eating meat, especially in Europe, because we have a food tradition, a food culture, and there is meat in there.
Yeah.
So that's, I don't know if I misheard it, and I never said vegan vision, but that for me sounds quite totalitarian.
Yeah, I don't know whether, there's obviously lots of ways that I wish the world worked, both when it comes to animals and other issues, and I don't know whether the world will ever get there, but I'm just saying, like, in this utopian world where everyone was so kind that they decided, you know what, I'm not going to eat any animal products, and they just chose to not eat them.
Okay.
You
You
know.
will. Okay, fine.
Mine too. I just want to
Most of us.
add most of the papers he mentioned. We already have all the papers and journals in my office or on my database. So if you want further information, especially the book Compassion on the Pound, I think.
By the pound, yeah.
By the pound. He will also speak, hopefully next year. I'm in contact.
Oh,
He's
great.
one of the few agriculture or economists, but it's really a pity to be in that way, because there are only 5 papers published in the whole economic journals dealing with vegetarianism. So it's really a shame, to be honest, in that way. But there are around 200 academic papers dealing in the social science. But economists, I think it's more or less the most hardest academic group to convince that they should do more research on that, because even the author on that book is that he was really frustrated that so few. But that's why we also invite students to do some research on that, or we support them, and we have now 2 master works running from students who try to write their paper. Okay.
So you were talking about, well, that stories work best, and also that, so we know now that stories work best, and also that we could have the biggest impact if we focused on fish and chicken. Now, I imagine that creating stories about fish might be harder than other animals. So I wonder, how do you, I mean, the big question really is, how do you measure things? How do we evaluate our work?
Yeah.
Where to start?
That's a very great question. Yes, and the answer to the first part of, you know, if stories are better, but it's harder to tell stories about chickens and fish, and people empathize less with those than pigs or cows, what is the best route to take? And the answer to that is we don't know. I mean, I could give guesses, but we don't know. So then the bigger question is your second one: how do we find out? One of the things that I took away from doing the research for Change of Heart, and also the new book Veganomics, is 2 things. So one is to stop making assumptions about what works better. And second is the value of doing direct testing to find out. So just as some of the studies in Change of Heart do direct testing on different messaging to influence behavior change and attitude change, one of the things I feel is most critical for us as the animal advocacy movement is to do direct testing to figure out what is most effective at inspiring change. And to that end, the other group that I work with in the United States, it's called the Humane League. We recently launched basically a research wing called Humane League Labs, which for anyone interested is online at humaneleaguelabs.com, where the goal is to do exactly that. So it's focused on promoting vegetarian vegan eating. So it's focused on that specifically. But we're starting to run all these tests to see what works better for doing that. And one of the question of focusing on chicken versus all animals versus other animals is one thing we're looking at. And so the way we're doing it, the way we're doing these tests, is basically creating different materials which have, you know, different variables in them, actually distributing them or disseminating them, showing them to the public, and then measuring actual diet change that people have after seeing each one of these. So for example, in one study we have a little booklet that talks about all farm animals, and another one we have one that talks just about chickens. And we're giving both out to different groups. We're going to measure the diet change of each group and see which spares the greatest number of animals.
How do you measure the diet change? How do you get replies?
So we're doing for this, we're doing 2 to 3 month follow-ups. So we are designing them in a way so that 2 to 3 months later we can reach out to these people again and ask them about their diet change. And so again, it's only 2 to 3 months down the line. It's not telling us a year down the line, but at least gives us some indication, something good to work off of, so that we as individuals, animal activists, and our groups can make kind of black and white strategy decisions based on. And we'll post all the results on that site, so if you're interested in seeing it as the studies come out, feel free to stay tuned.
Firstly, I want to say that I thank you for the talk, and I found the book, when I read it, very interesting. I would suggest for everybody to read it and debate it. It's very, very interesting. And with what I say now, I don't want to diminish any of that at all. But I have an issue with your seemingly hardcore utilitarianism. You really start counting, and you basically showed us a picture saying beef eating is less bad than chicken eating because for the same amount of beef you need fewer cows, and so there is less suffering. That thought to the end would mean let's all eat whale meat, or promote whale meat, because you have 1 whale for maybe 2,000 chickens. And isn't that a weird calculation? But essentially, I see the difference between maybe you've given up on the picture of having rights for non-humans as an end goal. So you say, for locally, for the next step, we look at reducing suffering because this is sort of real, and we might never get to this end goal. Maybe this is how you see it, but my vision still is rights for non-human animals that lead to a respect that just is then eventually the society governed by such understanding. And the way to that might not be reducing the most amount of suffering in the least amount of time. Maybe, what I mean is, for example, promoting whale meat instead of chicken meat might reduce suffering, but it might not get us any closer to a society with non-human rights because it doesn't sensitize people. It isn't a foot in the door because it is not a step in the direction of rights. And I see that with a number of other things. Basically, you're also suggesting not doing a campaign against, say, animals in circuses, as we did here. There's very few animals involved. But it changes possibly, maybe I'm just an alchemist, but it changes the attitude in people that they sort of, tigers are not anymore in this country animals that you can put on display and let them make some funny tricks for people. This is just a creature that you cannot treat like that, full stop. That is a societal agreement. And I feel that is a foot in the door towards animal rights, without reducing very much suffering. And that would also apply to your suggestion that we should promote only young people, or to target young people first. Maybe one could argue the young people become old and the old die, so we might not bother about the old. But it doesn't apply to the female-male thing, because maybe promoting, also targeting females now reduces suffering if you do it for 2 years. But maybe leaving out men means at the end that you're not coming towards this society because there's half society just doesn't follow. And maybe now it's harder to persuade men, but if you have done it, then the social norm argument comes and suddenly there is an avalanche of males turning vegetarian. So in the long run, it might be worth investing in male persuasion. So you think this is my issue?
Yeah, and to me it seems like we have the same goal, and so whereas you say that one of your goals is to have this country, this world where animals have rights and they're protected. And obviously, I imagine the reason you want that is not because philosophically it seems just and good, but because if animals are given rights, politically or culturally, socially, that means they won't be used, they won't be exploited, and therefore they won't be suffering and being killed. Would that be accurate? Like that is the goal, the reason to get to that society?
I'd say this is a common ground, but what is the last reason we might disagree?
Okay. So my sense, I guess that whatever area of disagreement aside, my sense is that the goal, our goal is the same, but what you're raising is the very true point or valid point that there are complexities that we have to keep in mind. And so, for example, with targeting women, if we don't target men at all, does that do less good in the long term because of some of these reasons? And the same could hold for other things, for example, like what political laws to try to pass and things like that. If there are other subsequent gains that we expect to get by working on an issue that doesn't help the most animals now, but we have good reason to believe will help more animals in the midterm or the long term, then yes, our goal is still the same. Our goal is still reducing as much suffering and getting to that world of saving as many animals as possible. It's just taking a more detailed look at the picture, which I absolutely think is important to do, and I think it's something that we need to do. So if there is a law we could pass that we think might not help a lot of animals now, but we are pretty certain or feel quite confident that will help more animals in the longer term, then that definitely could be the right thing to do. And if we think targeting men is going to do less good in the short term, but save more animals in the mid to long term, then definitely that would be the right thing to do, as long as we have something sound we're basing that on. In some of these examples, I have thought about that, and I don't think that's the case. Again, that's just my opinion, that's just my assumption. There's no way for me to know for sure, but just to give one example of this, with the women and the men, in the US, most of the vegan advocacy groups are focusing on young people, and some of them are focusing mostly just on women for these same reasons. And my sense from the research I did for Veganomics, if we look at the reasons people change their diet, most of it is not because of some activist promoting it. Mostly it's from friends, family, media, things like that. So my sense from the US, and looking at the growing number of vegetarians there, even though so much is focused on women and young people, is that those aren't the only areas where the number of vegetarians are growing. And that if we get many more women going vegetarian, we're going to get more men as well, because women are going to convince their boyfriends, their partners, their friends, their husbands, and so on and so forth to make those switches as well. So I don't think we lose much, and I think we gain a lot. Again, that's an assumption based on what's available, but that's my assumption. But I do think we need to take that detailed view. The last thing I wanted to say in that regard was what? Can't remember, so I'll have to leave it there. But yeah, I definitely think we should take as nuanced a viewpoint as we can. But I would say that for me, I err on the side of going with concrete big goods that I know will happen versus possible longer term goods that I don't see a straight line to by taking another route. So I do tend to err on the side of, if I know I can help a lot of animals now, I'm going to err on that side. And I think my thought is that we should always do that, but that's more my perspective.
The lady in the background, you ready? You wanted? You raised your hand. You wanted to say something? No. Okay. Good. Okay. Please.
When I buy a fish, I think I can distinguish between a fish who has been living in a fish farm, on a fish farm, or a fish who had been living in the open sea. Because on certain fish cans it is written, this fish comes from dolphin-friendly fishing. Isn't this a proof that this fish had been living in the sea?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I assume a factory farm would technically be dolphin-friendly because there's no dolphins being killed there. So I don't know. I imagine that what you're assuming is true, but I just don't know for sure. So I would suggest looking into it before making that assumption. I just don't know.
So, es gibt noch 2, 3 Fragen und dann können wir zum allgemeineren Teil, also die jetzt schon weg müssen, also wir sind, an und für sich haben wir ein paar Plätze im JAM, also die früher schon oder planen, wir können dann noch später noch ein paar Fragen stellen. Es gibt noch eine letzte Runde, die Dame hinten war noch nie. Ja. Bitte? Ja. Können Sie nur aufstehen und lauter sprechen?
Ich habe sehr viel mit Indigenen in der USA zu tun und seit Jahren, oh sorry, very much with Native Americans for years, for decades already. So in the past years they came up so often the issue of the buffalo being rape-wrecked or coming back to certain nations who can afford it, or so it's a matter of getting back their land from the farmers, from the white farmers, to sell out or to rent out. So for the tribes, actually the buffalo is a sacred animal and treated with respect, treated differently. But what I realized meanwhile, that many people start to breed buffalo the same way they raise cattle. Just for profit, just without any respect, just brought because it's something different. This is more than creatures actually. And what to do about this without otherwise going again over the Native Americans and their rights and their issues with those animals. Is there any research done on this one already?
I definitely have never read anything on that topic or really thought about it, so I'd be hesitant to really weigh in. It's an interesting situation, but yeah, anything I say would just be thoughts off the top of my head, so it probably wouldn't be of much value, unfortunately.
What I realized here in the supermarket, when I look what's going on, what's coming up, the buffalo mozzarella is very famous meanwhile. And someone from the supermarket told me once, it's not really good anymore after 4 days. So we just can forget it buying after 4 days because we don't have the quality anymore. But it's just for fame and it's for new stuff and whatever. So how to do something against this? Is there any idea, or Martin?
I think we are discussing more or less quite. We can discuss maybe this problem afterwards. What is really interesting is that there's quite a lot of research interconnecting. It's just published. And we are here at the university, and we are quite proud that we received from colleagues. They analyze how different movements. I didn't show you. You will receive a copy. How the different parts of a society, like so-called lifestyle movement and social movement, interconnect, and how, especially in the so-called word veganizing society, they work together, and in some way, Vienna or Austria is maybe a good example. And there is the first academic research paper. How the different approach, more or less the straightforward animal rights, especially in the law, because when you want to discuss with academics in the law, you need concept of theory of rights, and in that way, what you great explain is certainly the fascinating goal of veganizing. But certainly, as Martin Balluch in some way explains, if you want to certainly enforce law or put it in the constitution, you need in some way in some way old-fashioned concept of dealing with rights, or placing the concept of personhood in New Zealand. So I think it, and what in the last year the social research showed that the different ways of more or less just lifestyle and academic work, they bring quite huge effort in the same goal. Yeah. Okay, who? The last two questions, and then.
I can have another one.
Okay, please stand up and loud.
Okay, so it's about the foot in the door method. If you were to make a mistake, if you went out and you asked for something too big, can you take it back? Do you know any research about, big one first, then small, then big? Does that work?
So that's a good question, because very, very ironically, so in the book I talk about foot in the door, but I also talk about this technique called door in the face, which is exactly this. You basically, you make a big request that people are not going to agree to, and then when they say no, you say, oh, well, could you do this smaller thing instead? And people are more likely to do it than if you just make that small request from the start. So ironically, you can do it both ways, and both ways inspire people to make change. I mean, just one example of the door in the face. At one study, they went up to students on a campus and said, hey, would you spend 2 hours every weekend for the next year volunteering with these troubled kids or something like that? And like no one agreed. And then he said, okay, well, if you can't do that, could you come out once and do it for 1 2-hour session? And a very significant percentage agreed to and did. And then they went to other students and just asked them, hey, would you come out for this 1 2-hour session? And almost no one said yes. So ironically, either way seems to work.
And then after that, the foot in the door would work again?
I don't know of studies that try to combine them,
okay.
But my guess is that it would, yes. Because once you do that small thing, it does shift your self-identity, so you're probably more likely to.
It's the foot in the face principle.
Yeah, the Balak, also known as the Balak technique. Yeah.
Okay, also, die Dame vorne noch.
Yeah, can you also make a door in face and say something like go vegan and don't drive cars and so on, so on, so on. And if the person says no, so you can tell yeah, go vegan.
Yeah. Well, so the door in the face works when the small request is one that people are more likely to do. So if I asked you to donate $1 million to my charity, and you said, no way. And then I said, would you donate $100,000? You'd still say no way. Okay. But if I then ask you, would you donate $10? You'd be like, okay, I can do that. Mm-hmm. And so with the do all these things, no, okay, then how about just go vegan? The question is still like, are many people likely to go vegan? And I think that it's probably still not the best request. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, definitely the last two questions, okay? Loud.
You mentioned the argument that 75% of vegetarians or vegans switch back to eating meat
Yeah.
Do you know what have been the motives for these people starting vegetarianism, and what were the motives quitting it?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. So the latter is easier to answer. Why are people going back to eating meat? And it is the same. It is the 4 barriers that I put up. So taste and health are definitely the biggest reasons. Health actually is a little more often than taste the reason for people who are going back to eating meat. So health problems are the biggest, followed by taste, like just missing meat or thinking vegan food is not good, vegetarian food is not good. And then further down the list is convenience, and then somewhat further down at the bottom is social issues. But those are the main issues. The number of people going back to eating meat because they're eating, say, happy meat is very, very tiny. It's mostly those 4 barriers. And then so the question of who is backsliding? Is it people who go vegetarian for health reasons? Is it people who go vegetarian for environmental or animal welfare reasons? That's a good question. There's only one study so far that has looked at that, and it did not find a big difference. Now, it was only over a 3-year period. It only tracked people for 3 years, so it's not very comprehensive. But at least in those 3 years, animal-motivated vegetarians, health-motivated vegetarians, and environmental-motivated vegetarians all had roughly similar rates of going back to eating meat. That's the only one that exists so far. I'm actually working on a study right now to try to find more answers to that, but that's all the info we have so far.
I also yesterday had not the opportunity to give you. There is now a huge national report on Canada. Sorry, I forgot to mention it. And there was the first survey. There are 3 academic research why people switch back. There are quite a lot of research how and why people become vegetarian. There are only 3 academic, and one is the largest from a sociologist in Canada. And they say also that that's why the lifestyle movement, in some way, it's quite very important, because most of the people become isolated, socially isolated. The health reason is for young people not the main to switch back. So in that way, you see the different experts. We have different studies, and you for the next. But it's in that way. What I want to show, it's quite a fascinating area. It's a new research area in the topic of so-called vegetarian studies. And in Canada is the first. They analyzed the whole data. Why people? But it's also tragic. From 100 people, they used 1,000. Nearly 700, 600 went back. Yeah? And the main was why they felt isolated. It was in that way a social issue, but it's changing. That's why in some way, that's why I think even when some criticize the gluey vegetarian lifestyle, but for people it's very important to say I'm not how to say freaky. Yeah? So in that way, it helps to stay so-called normal. That what the Canadians do. And the other is from Herzog. Many people know this. It's also in German translated. And who are interested, Hall Herzog, you know him. It's quite a very well-known American professor. His book became translated last year in German. It was Warum lieben wir Tiere? Also das ist Hunde ähnlich wie die Melanin Joy. Sorry, ich mache auf Deutsch. And he did the second research, and he's a meat eater, and he was not. And for him it's also that for him it's also important to show that how complex and how important the social surrounding more or less, that the people stay on their moral beliefs. But I hope fully in every half a year with some supporters from the animal rights, we have interesting researcher here, and you can hear the new research, and so maybe you come back with new research. And yeah, I thank all the people for coming, and there is a possibility certainly we will go afterwards to Yum, or we. Yeah. And thank you for your.
Thank you all. Thank you.